Welcome. I am Sister Who. The full name is actually Sister Who Does She Think She Is? Which is both an exclamation and a serious question. Through the television shows that I hope you'll share with me, we'll be exploring more about life and spirituality and what it is that who we think we are has to do with how we present ourselves in the world, how we interact with those who are different from ourselves, how we learn and grow and reach our own full potential. What to make of Sister Who? I suppose it's a celebration of color, of symbolism, all sorts of metaphors, ways of understanding, ways of being, ways of looking at the world, ways of looking at others. Understanding that someone else's difference is not something that needs to threaten us, but something that can be a sort of mirror to help us see parts of ourselves that maybe we hadn't looked at before. It's an ongoing adventure, something that I've actually been on for quite some time, and that I'm very happy to be here to share with each of you now. When I'm quite sure if anyone would have told me 7 and 8 years ago that I would be here doing this today, that I would have been quite amazed and laughed loudest myself probably. But it has been an interesting adventure, finding a spiritual alter ego, if you will, and allowing for creative expression, allowing myself to venture into metaphorical realms where I can look at life and say what is good and what is bad, and what decides how a person should dress, or how a person should be, or how a person should understand God. To borrow an oft-repeated expression, I suppose my conclusion is, well, whatever works. And the challenge, though, is that it's something different for each one of us. Sister Who is a minister of sorts, dealing with those gray areas in the middle where each of us is trying to find what does work for me. All sorts of people offer all sorts of different things. Each different church has a different answer. To me, spirituality is this incredibly huge territory to cover. There's so much territory to explore, and every exploration that I can remember, whether in real life or in TVs and movies, anytime there's a group of people and there's a lot of ground to cover, the first thing they say is, well, maybe we should split up. You check out that section and you check out that area, and we'll all meet back here at a certain time to discuss what we've learned and what we found out. In the same way, it seems to me that explains how an abundance of different churches and belief systems, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, New Age spirituality, within Christianity, everything from Protestant Pentecostals to the Russian Orthodox Church. It's like we're all different scouting troops checking out this huge area, and at some point we can all come back together and compare notes and see what we found. Because the realm of spirituality is so broad. We have to find out what works, and what makes it all the more intriguing is that the same things, for whatever reason, don't work for everyone. I don't know why that would be, and yet it does seem to be the case. So I'm here as Sister Who. And, yes, I am gay. But I have no intention of making this a specifically gay show. I try to draw a lot on common sense in exploring new areas of life and new ways of being. One of the sayings that comes to mind is that we're all in this together. However you define yourself, everything is interconnected. And I think where during future shows I might be discussing things that have, I might be describing them with my own unique spin on things, my own unique experience of something. But very often what we're talking about is something that everyone can relate to. Relationships are relationships, whether it's a traditional marriage relationship or whether it's a non-traditional relationship between two gay men or two lesbians who have been together for years. It's the same sort of issues of defining roles, of defining how to deal with the outside world, how to deal with other people's expectations of whether your ages are the same or different. I do have a life partner, and we've been together for a number of years, but we have a wide difference in our ages, and which you couldn't tell by meeting us because he looks young and I look older than I am, I suppose. But the point is, when we discuss relationships, it's not like there's one right way to be, because anytime you have two human personalities and you're asking them to mix and share the same space, I meet so many people who are saying, you know, if I just had a life partner, that would solve everything. And I kind of snicker respectfully and just say, no, you really don't know what you're saying. A relationship, anytime you ask two people to share the same space, it's not about sharing the bedroom so much as about sharing the checkbook and the bathroom and the kitchen and all the responsibilities, and even more so sharing a future. And if there are children involved, that's another thing that suddenly has to be negotiated. For any relationship to work, it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of openness to different sorts of solutions and a lot of flexibility, people listening and responding to what's going on and going from wherever they're at. Sometimes that bridges into a church family as well, in which there's a system of belief, a way of answering who is God and what is my purpose in life, and what are the rules, what rules work for me. Sister Who is kind of one of those ministers in the gray areas, trying to explore how do we redevelop our rules. How do we know when we've outgrown a particular rule? How do we know when a rule that we've had for a long time still works? So a lot of different things to discuss, and especially in these times when things are becoming more and more multicultural and more interconnected. Through the computer internet, we can immediately talk to people on the other side of the world now. 30 years ago, this was not the case. Things are changing so rapidly. And yet in the midst of all, I think there is still a body of wisdom and knowledge and experience that hasn't gone out of style. But it's an essence that's taking on a different expression. As Sister Who, there's a lot of, I've actually been called, believe it or not, I've actually been called too conservative and not radical enough by a number of people, which is amusing, you know, especially being dressed like this. I look at the essences of things and I try to find a core of life that is really worth hanging on to, but something that will also serve whatever direction life goes. I remember reading a section toward the end of Henry David Thoreau's book, Walton, where he talks about coming to the point of death and realizing that you've never got around to living. And so I try to fill my life with adventure, but to make it a constructive, healthy adventure. Having a balance between faith and skepticism, and knowing that in the interconnectedness of all things, the answers that are worth believing in will stand all the cross-examination you want to subject them to. You know, to look at it from as many different perspectives. Another metaphor I often use is that of a jigsaw puzzle, in which it's like God gave us this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of this incredibly diverse picture. And everybody was so thrilled with the challenge of putting together this jigsaw puzzle that we all dived in and grabbed pieces and started looking for how it could fit. The problem was, with that many pieces to fit, the job took longer than we expected, and we became so focused on the piece in our hand that we forgot all the other pieces in the puzzle. And in that our piece might have been green, we decided, well, the puzzle must be green. And somebody presented a blue piece, and we said, no, that doesn't fit. Well, it doesn't fit next to our piece, maybe, but it does fit somewhere within the scheme of things. And someone else had a piece of a puzzle that was orange, and said, well, I think the puzzle is mostly orange. There's no way to know that. We don't have the benefit of that broad of a perspective. And so we each have our puzzle pieces. And if we begin by trusting that those people who are born into the world are those people who are supposed to be born into the world, and those pieces of the puzzle that we find in our hands are those pieces of the puzzle that do belong someplace. And so it doesn't become a question of possible or impossible, good or bad, in or out, included, excluded, but it becomes a question of how. Relating to science as a sort of metaphor for life, in the way science has, in its system of choices, of belief choices, in the way it has answered questions. There's an interaction, interconnectedness in all things, remember. Well, there are things that were in our old Hollywood movies of what happens in outer space that provided questions for science to deal with. And the good scientists were not concerned with the fact that, well, it was a silly Hollywood movie. They said, well, they presented that. Now, just for the sake of learning something new, how could such a thing actually be possible? How could you actually do that? And they begin to explore and discover new ways of doing things that we had never thought of looking in that direction before. We had never thought of taking a mechanical, applying an elevator to a stage, for example. There are some Broadway shows where, some Broadway productions that I've heard of, where they actually raise and lower stages to where everyone goes off, the curtain closes, and the curtain opens on a new set, and the audience doesn't realize that the stage they were just looking at is now in the basement, and the one they were looking at before was up on the second floor. I mean, it's a mechanical principle applied to a theatrical device. And in the same way as we interconnect things, science looking at movies and saying, how would that be possible? And coming up with a new scientific way of approaching things. You know, who dreamed when the first episode of Star Trek came on television that we could ever get to the point of actually having computers that we could talk to? Granted, it's been a very difficult process and it's not totally refined. But we're to the point where we can actually talk to computers now. In the 1960s, I don't know if anyone conceived of that as happening. It took an artist and a philosopher, I suppose, in Hollywood to present this, to give a scientist the idea to explore how could I actually do that. In looking at people and populations, it also becomes this question. You know, in that everything's interconnected, science and God are not connected either. And someone recently asked me if science explains something that has always been attributed to God, whether that means that, fine, we've answered the question and God is an illusion. I don't know whether God's an illusion or not. All that would answer to me, if I said God did such and someone gave me a scientific explanation, I would say, well, maybe God did it through natural means, or maybe God didn't do that, but it still doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It just means that God wasn't what I thought God was. We all have our different takes on spirituality and on understanding who and what God is. I think people need to go with what works for them. For some people it's one thing, for some people it's another. There's nothing to me that says someone believing God is this when I don't believe that God is that means that God is any less real. What is at stake is not that which God is. What is at stake is my understanding of God. And to understand that this is not something totally separate from life, but this has to do with how I interact with people, with how I interact with the person I see in the mirror each morning when I get up, with how I make choices about what I do with my life. with how I make choices about who, forgive me for using this terminology, who are the valuable people. It's interesting as I look back over history, of recorded history of humanity, that it's like there was always this level of the people who didn't count. And as time goes on, the level keeps getting lower. 200 years ago, someone born with a disability was among the people who didn't count, and they might be locked away in an attic and forgotten about. Now we're to the point of having the American with Disabilities Act, where new buildings are often required to establish ways of accessing spaces, ways of getting around staircases, ways of including people who would have been marginalized 100 years ago, which to me is wonderful. It's a little more work, but it's wonderful, because then we have somebody's contribution that we wouldn't have had before. To exclude a person with disability, to exclude a person on the basis of race or creed or religion or who they fall in love with, is to deny yourself their contribution, and thereby to impoverish yourself. It, I think, is a legitimate question. How long would World War II have lasted if the Nazi Code had not been broken? Or perhaps it would have been broken later by another person. As it was broken by a gay man who was later well, as I understand it, actually wound up committing suicide because of societal pressures that he endured after the war, because he was gay. During the war, of course, everyone's attention was on the conflict between Nazis and Allies and conflicts in other places. And no one cared about who you fell in love with or all that stuff. It wasn't important during the war. After the war, we went back to, unfortunately, moralizing on a whole lot of things. And what he went through eventually caused him to commit suicide. As history stands, though, the Nazi Code was broken by a man who happened to be gay. He had a contribution to make. If prior to World War II we had disallowed everyone who was gay from contributing to the war effort because they were considered to be subhuman, immoral, unnatural, what have you, how long would it have taken everyone else to break the Nazi Code, and how long would the war have lasted, and how many more people would have died? And that's just one example. There are people of various disabilities, of various ethnicities, various religions, various... I mean, there's this old saying about who is from the wrong side of the tracks. Well, if you really believe that we're all in this together, there is no wrong side of the tracks. It is just a whole range of people, everybody with something different to contribute. Sister Who also, different, but with something to contribute. And it may help you. There's no insinuation at any point that everyone is supposed to be like Sister Who. I don't think everyone should be like anyone. Each person needs to be like themselves. One of the metaphors I've used in the past is that it's like every person, well, to back up a second. When I was in college, occasionally I would get what was called a care package. For anyone who might be unfamiliar with that terminology, it's a box sent from, sometimes from home, sometimes from someone who cares about you in another space, cares about you who lives somewhere else. I mean, one care package I got was from a retired school teacher that I used to do jobs for a lot while I was in high school. And I learned so much from that woman. She was just an inspiration to me. But the lessons that I learned from her were, you know, in the classroom was her flower beds and various other places where there were just things that needed to be done, and we would talk, and I learned so much from her, much more than I did in high school, I'm afraid. But when I was in college, she was among the people who would occasionally send me a care package. It's essentially a box in which a wide diversity of things are placed. Some things that almost seem paradoxical. I mean, there might be a book on eating healthy right next to a Snickers candy bar. You know, whatever. It was all sorts of different things that she thought I would like, and that I did like. maybe a book about some subject we discussed, a book that I hadn't read yet, or a book that I'd mentioned to her I always wanted to read. Something sweet to put a feeling of a happy little dessert in the middle of the day, right? Perhaps after a especially trying exam. A warm sweater for winter, in that I went to college in a very cold climate in the northern part of the United States. It was a whole range of different things. And each person, I think, is like a care package from God. He sends this care package to earth. The person is born, and we begin to open the box, or we begin to allow the person to open their own box and to find out what's inside of them, what they have to give, what they have to share with the people around them. And maybe it's a specific talent. Maybe it's a particular insight. Maybe it's a different way of communicating. And somehow, as more and more things come out of the box, everyone around becomes richer, becomes empowered by having all these things to draw from. It's like having a toolbox in your workshop. And if you have one screwdriver, there will be some screws that you're never able to use. And if you have one size wrench, there are some bolts you'll never be able to loosen. And so the more wrenches, the more bolts, the more gifts from inside these care packages that come out, the more things we have to work with, and the more ways we can explore what this incredible thing that life is can do, and what's possible. Too often, though, people begin to open the care package that is themselves, and they pull something out, and maybe someone in the room doesn't like the color. Oh, put that back. We don't want that out here. Well, we have one less sweater in the room, if that's what it was. And there may be another person in the room who wore just that size who will now be cold. And so it begins to negatively impact everyone else around. We really have to understand that we're all connected, and that every gift that comes out is a gift from God to be included someplace, somehow. And that as we explore and understand how all these objects in the book correspond, in the box, correspond to all the people in the room, or stepping outside the metaphor, to all the people in the world, we begin to understand how every care package is a gift of empowerment, a way that needs can be addressed, problems can be resolved, understanding rather than miscommunication can happen. In the end credits of every show, I always include an address. I mention that now for anyone who is interested in writing to me, anyone who's interested in being a guest on a future show. Perhaps there's something you'd like to discuss real directly. In the past, we've done shows on everything from growing older to people with disabilities to liberation theology, metaphysics, all sorts of wonderful things. And in everything, even those things that don't seem to have any direct connection to my life, I find that I end the show with a broader understanding of what's possible, of people I may meet someday, and in looking at the mirror of those subjects, I begin to understand more of who I am and how I relate to things, and why in certain situations something happens and it's like somebody pushed my button and I suddenly turn from Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. And I don't know why I would respond so strongly to something like that. Why I would behave in ways that I really regret and wish to apologize for later. I want to do what's right, and yet there is so much of me that seems subconsciously motivated. Which I guess comes back again to the name. Sister, who does she think she is? And who do I think I am? And the more I refine who I think I am, the more I can move on into new situations that I wouldn't have thought myself possible of before. One of the interesting things in the number of shows that I've done in other locations before coming here is the way that we started with shows that were very scripted, where I tried to hash out my ideas beforehand and to get a sense of what I would say and how we would progress, and to have a theme of some kind. And as the shows went on, as my sense of who this part of me that is Sister Who developed, the more we went to fewer and fewer scripts. So here we are doing the show today, and I'm happy to be here, and I want to serve this moment as well as I can, and to offer as much that is genuinely helpful as I possibly can, to encourage people to look beyond the routines and to find that which really makes them alive, that thing for which they really have a passion, the thing that they would do whether they got paid for it or not, because they just love doing it so much. And I think everyone has that, but the routines and roles of life don't always encourage us to find those things. I think for me, though, Sister Who embodies a lot of that. And that's how, as the shows progressed, as we did all these different shows, and now as we come to do this first show videotaped in Montana, and it's been a very exciting time for me building up to this, and the privilege of being here to share with you, that this show was entirely unscripted. There's not a cue card out there with even a theme anywhere. And I'm trusting my intuition and trusting my heart and trusting, I guess you could say, divine guidance as we do this. And who's to know which it is, or whether it is, or what happens? It's a risk. It's a step into vulnerability. To end with a few brief explanations of Sister Who's costume, or perhaps just one, because we're coming right down to the final minute here. The costume is cutouts, because I think we need to embrace our vulnerability. It's difficult, but I think through this show, there's a lot of things that we'll learn from embracing our vulnerability. Join me again next time, please, and blessings be upon you.